She fled the faith that bound her and fell into the arms of a man who would teach her what it was to feel everything. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel. We post daily. Continuing, the sun was setting over Promise Valley like a tired eye resisting closure. The wooden and stone houses, all facing the central temple, seemed to bow in silent devotion as the last lights of day gilded the bell tower. It was Sunday. The air carried the weight of recently finished prayers and the silence that only exists after a sermon about hell. Helen adjusted the collar of her white cotton dress as she descended the stone steps of the church. 23 years old, and not a single day of true freedom. Her brown hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it gave her headaches. Her posture was erect, not by choice, but by years of corrections with a ruler on her back. She smiled without showing her teeth because a decent woman doesn't expose herself. That's what her father taught. That's what everyone expected. Helen, don't stray. Augustus's voice, her fiancé, came like a whip disguised as concern. 38 years old, a widower, treasurer of the congregation, and the second most powerful figure in the church, second only to the pastor himself. Your father is talking to Sister Bernadette about our wedding flowers. The wedding, only 3 weeks away. Helen felt her stomach clench every time she thought about it. Not that she had any other prospects. Since she was 15, she knew this was her destiny. A blessed union, as Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher, her father, announced in services. An example of feminine obedience and masculine leadership, as ordained in the scriptures. Augustus placed his hand on her waist, pressing his fingers against the thin fabric of her dress. It wasn't affection, it was possession. Helen swallowed hard, feeling more like property than a bride. Let's go to the car. I arranged with your father that I'd take you to dinner at my house. My sister prepared a roast for us to get to know each other better. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It's time for you to get used to your future home. Helen nodded, because nodding was what she had learned to do. Daughter of the pastor, heir to a doctrine that allowed no questions. Her mother had died when she was only 8, and since then, her world had been confined to the 4 walls of the parsonage, the hard pews of the church, and the tireless lessons on modesty, obedience, and submission. They were walking across the central square when a strange silence fell over the group of faithful still chatting after the service. Eyes turned to the main street that led to the square. Helen felt Augustus's fingers tighten even more around her waist. What is that demon doing here? The murmur came from somewhere behind her. It was then that she saw him for the first time. The man everyone called the Desert Monster crossed the square with heavy steps. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing worn jeans and a dark flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His unshaven beard and dark hair falling over his forehead couldn't hide what was most striking. His eyes, intense, challenging, as if they held fire instead of irises. Raphael Miller. The man her father had preached about that very night, the lone wolf, temptation incarnate, the example of what happens when one abandons the path of righteousness. The owner of the farm on the outskirts of town, inherited from a father no one remembered clearly. A man who didn't attend church, didn't participate in community festivals, and he, according to rumors, lived off shady dealings with people from the capital. Helen had never seen him so close. The town's children grew up hearing stories about how he captured stray sheep for pagan rituals, or how he transformed into a beast on full moon nights. Nonsense, of course, but the fear was real. And there he was, crossing the sacred ground of the square as if the looks of disapproval were just a passing breeze. Raphael stopped in front of the small market at the corner of the square, the only one still open after Sunday service. Helen noticed he was buying groceries. Something so mundane, so human, that it almost seemed comical compared to the stories they told. Come on, Helen. Augustus pulled her forcefully. I don't want you exposed to that presence. It was at that moment that Raphael turned his face and their gazes met. For an instant, Helen felt as if time had frozen. His eyes, a brown so dark they seemed black, fixed on hers with a disconcerting intensity. There was no judgment there, as in the eyes of the faithful, nor possession, as in Augustus's. There was something different, something she couldn't name. Helen! Her father's voice cut through the moment. Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher approached with rapid strides, his face red with indignation. Get in Augustus's car this instant. But something had changed within her. That brief look had awakened something she didn't know existed. A question, a possibility, and she hesitated. Raphael left the market and walked toward them, carrying a paper bag of groceries. The faithful moved away, as if he carried a contagious disease. "Pastor," he greeted in a deep, calm voice. "Your sermon about me today was particularly creative, especially the part where you suggest I sacrifice animals by moonlight." Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher raised his chin, his small eyes glinting behind his thin-rimmed glasses. "I didn't mention your name, Miller. You didn't have to. The desert monster is specific enough." The tone was calm, but there was a firmness that made Helen shiver. "I just wonder why so much effort to demonize a man who just wants to live in peace." "Peace?" Augustus stepped forward, pulling Helen behind him as if protecting her. "Is that what you call your nefarious influence? Your progressive ideas reaching our children, the forbidden books we know you hide on your property?" Raphael chuckled, a low sound devoid of humor. His eyes met Helen's again as she watched the scene over her fiancé's shoulder. "Books are dangerous only to those who fear people thinking for themselves." He paused and then added, looking directly at Helen, "just as control is only necessary when one fears the freedom of another." Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. It was as if he spoke directly to her, as if he saw beyond appearances, beyond the modest dress and submissive posture. "Enough." Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher took a step forward. "You are not welcome here, Miller. This square belongs to the faith community of Promise Valley, and your presence contaminates our moment of communion." "The square is public, Pastor, and as far as I know, I pay my taxes like any citizen." Raphael remained calm, but his eyes didn't leave Helen's. "And perhaps your daughter should have the right to decide who she wants to be with, instead of being pushed from one man to another as if she were church property." The silence that followed was thick as fog. Augustus lunged forward, his face contorted in fury. But the pastor stopped him with a gesture. "My daughter was raised in the ways of the Lord. She knows her place and her responsibilities." The pastor spoke with the same intonation he used in the pulpit. "And in 3 weeks, she will be married to a God-fearing man, protected from evil influences like yours." Raphael took a step forward, ignoring Augustus, ignoring the pastor, his eyes fixed only on Helen. "Is that what you want?" he asked her directly. "Is this the life you chose?" The world seemed to paralyze. Never, in her entire life, had anyone asked Helen what she wanted. Her choices had always been made by others: what clothes to wear, what words to say, what dreams to have, what man to accept. And now, before the entire congregation, a stranger, the very man the community feared, was offering her something she had never had: the power to decide. "This is absurd!" Augustus gripped her arm tightly, pulling her back. "Helen is my fiancée. Our marriage is God's will." "Is it his will?" Raphael pointed to the pastor. "Or yours, because it doesn't seem to be hers." Helen looked at her father, at Augustus, at the horrified faces of the faithful watching the scene. Then she looked at Raphael, at those eyes that didn't demand, only asked. Her voice came out weak, almost inaudible. She cleared her throat and tried again, surprised by her own sound. "I never had a choice." "There's always a choice." Raphael extended his hand, not to touch her, just as an invitation. "Even when they try to convince you otherwise." "Helen, don't be ridiculous." The pastor's voice was tense. "This man is trying to manipulate you. Everything we've built, everything we've planned, everything you planned." Helen heard her own voice gain strength. "I never planned any of it." Augustus squeezed her arm harder, his fingers leaving marks on her fair skin. "You are embarrassing your father, your church. You are embarrassing me." It was that pain, that pressure of his fingers on her flesh, that finally broke something inside Helen. 23 years of silence and obedience, crumbling in a single instant of clarity. She pulled her arm away forcefully, freeing herself from his grip. "No." The word came out as a whisper at first, then louder. "No, I don't want this. I never did." Augustus's face contorted into a mask of fury. "You don't know what you're saying. It's this demon. He's putting thoughts in your head." "The thoughts were always here." Helen touched her own temple. I just never had permission to say them out loud. She took a step back, moving away from both her fiancé and her father. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. Fear and excitement mingled in her blood like fire and ice. Helen, if you leave here now, you will be dead to me. The pastor's voice was cold as altar stone. There will be no turning back. She looked at the man who had raised her, at the father who had never known how to be a father, only a pastor, only an authority. And she realized that his threat was not a period, but a liberation. Perhaps one must die a little to finally begin to live. The words came as if they weren't hers, as if another, braver Helen spoke for her. Then, without looking back, she walked to Raphael. She didn't take his hand, didn't ask for protection. She just stood beside him, feeling strangely complete in her incompleteness, strong in her vulnerability. "Are you sure?" Raphael asked softly, just for her to hear. Helen nodded, and for the first time, the gesture was not one of submission, but of choice. "You'll regret this," Augustus's voice echoed across the square. "No one abandons this congregation without paying the price." Raphael remained calm, just giving Helen a slight nod to follow him to his car, an old pickup truck parked on the corner. The drive to Raphael's farm was made in silence. Helen watched the landscape change through the passenger window, the organized houses of Promise Valley giving way to open fields, then to denser vegetation that announced the limits of the Miller property. The sun had already set completely, and the first stars dotted the sky as the pickup advanced along a dirt road. "Why are you doing this?" Helen finally broke the silence. "Why help me? You don't even know me." Raphael kept his eyes on the road, his fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel. "I recognize a prison when I see one," he replied simply, and I couldn't ignore it. Helen looked at her own hands, pale and trembling in her lap. "Everyone in town thinks you're some kind of monster. People fear what they don't understand, and your father did a good job making sure no one understood." He shrugged. "It's easier to control scared people." The farm appeared after a bend, revealing itself under the silvery light of the crescent moon. It was nothing like Helen had imagined. No sinister ruins or strange symbols. It was a well-kept property, with a main house of wood and stone, a barn beside it, fields stretching as far as the eye could see, and a small lake that reflected the starry sky. Raphael parked near the porch and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. "You can stay as long as you need," he said, breaking the silence. "There's a guest room I haven't used in years, but it's clean. Tomorrow we can discuss your plans, where you want to go, what you want to do." Helen stared at him, confused. "You don't expect me to—" Raphael let out a brief laugh, the first she had heard from him. "I'm not rescuing you from a tyrant to become another, Helen." His eyes met hers in the dim light of the car. "You are free here, free to stay, free to leave, free to set your own limits." He got out of the car and Helen followed him, taking a deep breath of the night air. The smell was different there, damp earth, fresh grass, freedom. There was no constant weight of church incense, nor the suffocating scent of Augustus's strong cologne. The house was simple inside, but comfortable. Rustic furniture, some scattered books, a stone fireplace. There were no crucifixes on the walls, no framed scriptures, just a few old photographs and a landscape painting. Helen felt strangely at ease in that unfamiliar space. Raphael showed her the room, small, clean, with a single bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the field. "The bathroom is down the hall. There are clean towels in the cabinet. Make yourself at home." Before leaving, he stopped at the door. "Helen, I know you're scared. I know all this happened too fast. But I want you to know, you made a courageous choice today. Perhaps the bravest of your life." When he closed the door, Helen sat on the bed, feeling the mattress yield under her weight. For the first time since she could remember, there was no one telling her what to do, how to sit, how to breathe. The silence around her was not one of disapproval, but of possibility. She stood up, went to the window, and opened it completely. The night air came in like a caress, bringing with it the scent of the fields and the soft murmur of crickets. Helen loosened her tight bun, letting her brown hair fall over her shoulders. She took off her shoes and felt the wooden floor under her bare feet. And then Without warning, tears came, not of fear or sadness, but of relief. Like a dam finally breaking after years of holding back turbulent waters, she cried silently, letting out everything she had held inside for so long. The girl who lost her mother too soon. The teenager who was never allowed to discover who she was. The young woman forced to accept a future others had designed for her. When the tears dried, Helen felt exhausted, but curiously light. She lay on the bed without taking off her white dress, that same dress that symbolized everything she had left behind. Tomorrow would be another day, the first day of the rest of her life. A life of her own. On the other side of the closed door, Raphael sat in the living room with an open book on his lap, but his eyes couldn't focus on the words. He thought of the young woman now sleeping in his guest room, of her gaze when she finally made her decision in the square, of the silent courage he saw born there. He also thought of his own mother, how she never had a chance to escape, how she was consumed by a faith that demanded absolute submission, how she died believing her devotion would save her. He couldn't help her then. Perhaps he could make a difference now for this woman who had found the strength to break her own chains. Raphael closed the book and looked out the window, at the moon bathing his fields in silver. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel hope, a feeling he had long forgotten how to savor. The first ray of sun found Helen already awake. She had slept deeply, without the usual nightmares that haunted her in the parsonage. She got up, still wearing the crumpled white dress, and went to the window. The farm at dawn was a completely different sight, alive, vibrant, full of possibilities. Green fields stretched to a tree line in the distance. A group of horses grazed peacefully near a fence. The morning mist slowly dissipated, revealing a world she barely knew. Helen heard movements coming from the kitchen. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She opened the bedroom door and followed the hallway, uncertain of what to expect, but determined to face this new day, the first of many in which she could finally discover who she truly was, far from the impositions of Promise Valley, far from the suffocating shadow of the pulpit. She paused at the kitchen entrance, watching Raphael with his back to her, making coffee. It was when he turned, meeting her gaze, that Helen realized there was no turning back, and surprisingly, it didn't scare her. For the first time in her life, the unknown was not a threat, it was a promise. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the rustic kitchen. Helen remained for a moment at the entrance, observing Raphael with his back to her. He wore jeans and a simple t-shirt, so different from the oppressive formality of the men of Promise Valley. His movements were confident, decisive, without the theatrical affectation her father and Augustus displayed. "Good morning," she finally said, her voice still carrying the weight of the decision made the night before. Raphael turned, holding a steaming mug. For an instant, his eyes scanned the crumpled dress she still wore, but there was no judgment in his gaze. "Good morning, did you sleep well?" He offered the mug to her. Helen accepted, feeling the warmth of the coffee in her hands. A simple gesture, but one that carried a normalcy she had never experienced. "Better than in a long time," she confessed, taking a cautious sip. The taste was strong, unsweetened, nothing like the weak tea allowed at home. "I made eggs and there's bread. Nothing elaborate, but it will sustain you." Raphael indicated the small wooden table where breakfast was served. "Later we can sort out your clothes. You can't just wear that dress." Helen nodded, sitting at the table. She ate in silence, savoring each bite as if it were the first time. In a way it was eating without having to listen to sermons, without having every movement observed and corrected. "Why did you do it?" she asked again, placing her fork on the plate. "Why help me?" Raphael sat opposite her, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that wasn't intimidating, just attentive. "My mother used to attend your father's church," he began, his voice lower, more controlled. "A long time ago, before you were born, probably. It was a smaller congregation then, but the methods were the same. Control, manipulation, fear." Helen felt a shiver run down her spine, but she didn't interrupt. "My father wasn't a religious man. He was a farmer, practical, simple. But he loved my mother." Raphael took a sip of coffee. When she started to change, to distance herself, to repeat the pastor's words as if they were her own, he tried to argue. It was the worst mistake he could make. What happened? Helen asked, though she feared the answer. The pastor convinced my mother that my father was an evil influence, that she needed to distance herself. She took the little she had and took me to live in a small room behind the church. His eyes fixed on a distant point, as if seeing those memories unfold. I was 10 years old. My father tried to get us back, but she refused to see him. The pastor said he was possessed, that he wanted to contaminate us with his disbelief. Helen felt a knot in her throat. That sounded exactly like her father's tactics. My mother fell ill, an illness that could have been easily treated if she had gone to the doctor in time. But the pastor said it was a divine trial, that faith would cure her. Raphael paused, his jaw tense. When I finally convinced her to go to the hospital, it was too late. "I'm so sorry," Helen murmured, genuinely moved. "My father took me back, but he never fully recovered. He died 5 years ago, leaving me this farm." Raphael looked at her directly again. "So, when I saw you yesterday, when I saw the same look my mother had, someone trapped in a golden cage, I couldn't stand by. Not this time." The silence that followed was thick, laden with untold stories, with shared pains. Helen felt something shift between them, a deeper understanding, a connection that went beyond that moment. "What happens now?" she asked, finally. "That depends on you." Raphael stood up, collecting the plates. "As I said, you can stay as long as you need, but eventually you'll have to decide what you want to do with your life." The idea was simultaneously terrifying and liberating. Helen had never planned a future of her own. There had always been someone to tell her the next step, the next obligation. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. "With the basics, then." Raphael offered a slight smile, the first she had seen from him since she arrived. "First, new clothes. I have some shirts that might fit temporarily. Then we can go to the neighboring town to buy what you need. It's big enough that no one from Promise Valley will bother us." 2 hours later, Helen looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, almost not recognizing the woman who stared back at her. She wore one of Raphael's plaid shirts, too big, tied at the waist over a pair of old jeans he had found at the back of the closet. She had washed her hair and left it down, falling in waves over her shoulders. No makeup, no ornaments, just herself, in her rawest, truest form. The trip to the neighboring town was silent, but not uncomfortable. Helen watched the landscape through the pickup's window, absorbing every detail as if seeing the world for the first time. In a way, it was exactly that. In town, Raphael let her choose her own clothes, another novelty. All her life, her wardrobe had been dictated by church rules. Nothing colorful, nothing tight, nothing that could incite impure thoughts. Now, faced with so many options, she felt lost, but deliciously free. "Try this," Raphael suggested, pointing to a turquoise blouse. "It would match your eyes." Helen blushed slightly but took the item. In the changing room, she contemplated her reflection again, now with a blouse that highlighted the blue of her eyes and jeans that, although simple, defined her curves in a way that would never have been allowed in Promise Valley. It was like discovering a new body, a body that belonged to her. In the days that followed, Helen gradually adapted to life on the farm. Raphael showed her the property, the stables where he kept some horses, the fields where he grew a variety of vegetables, the small orchard behind the house. It wasn't a grand operation, but it was self-sufficient and honest, so different from the financial manipulations that sustained her father's church. On a particularly warm afternoon, while helping Raphael harvest tomatoes in the garden, Helen asked the question that had been on her mind for days. "Why do you live so isolated? The farm is beautiful. You could have friends, visitors." Raphael didn't answer immediately, concentrating on selecting ripe tomatoes. "After my father died, I tried to connect with the community." He finally said, "I offered the farm for events, tried to participate in local fairs. But your father—" He paused, choosing his words. "Your father has a very strong influence in Promise Valley. People looked at me with suspicion, repeated the stories he told about me. That you were some kind of pagan sorcerer," Helen completed, with a slight tone of irony. Raphael chuckled, a low, genuine sound she was beginning to appreciate. Something like that. Eventually, I got tired of trying. I decided that if they wanted a monster, I would give them something to fear by keeping my distance, appearing just enough to fuel the rumors, but never to truly know the man behind them. Helen felt a pang of sadness for him. It sounds lonely. Sometimes. He shrugged, but his eyes revealed more than his words. But there's a certain peace in living on your own terms, even if it means being alone. That night, after dinner, Helen discovered Raphael's library, a small room with walls covered in books, philosophy, classic literature, science, history, poetry, titles that had never been allowed in the parsonage. She ran her fingers over the spines, feeling like a child before a treasure chest. "You can read whatever you want," Raphael said, standing at the door, watching her. "There are no forbidden books here." Helen took out a volume of poetry and sat in a worn armchair. She opened the book and began to read aloud, savoring each word as if it were forbidden fruit. Raphael stood listening, leaning against the doorframe, his eyes never leaving her face. Weeks passed. The date that would have been her wedding to Augustus came and went, without ceremony, without empty promises, without trapping herself in a future others had planned. Helen felt herself blossom, like the plants she now helped cultivate in the farm garden. She began to learn about country life, how to ride a horse without fear, how to feel the earth between her fingers and know if it was ready for planting, how to look at the sky and predict rain. Raphael was a patient teacher, never condescending, always respecting her pace, and there were moments, brief, unexpected, when their hands accidentally touched as they worked side by side, or when their gazes met across the table during dinner, and something electric, alive, pulsed between them. But Raphael never crossed the line, never pressured, never assumed, until the night of the storm. The sky darkened quickly that afternoon, turning day into premature night. The wind began to howl around the house, making the windows rattle. Helen was in the kitchen, making tea, when the first thunderclaps shook the sky. "It's going to be a strong storm." Raphael entered, bringing firewood for the fireplace. "The horses are agitated." "Should we check on them?" Helen asked, watching the rain begin to fall heavily. Raphael nodded, grabbing 2 raincoats hanging near the door. "If you can help me, it would be good. We need to calm them down." They ran to the stable under the torrential rain, mud staining their boots, lightning illuminating the path in ghostly flashes. The horses whinnied nervously, agitated by the thunder. Helen had never been so close to animals during a storm. In the parsonage, she stayed locked in her room, praying as instructed, while nature raged outside. Raphael showed her how to calm the animals, speaking softly, stroking their necks, ensuring they were safe. Helen observed the gentleness with which he treated the horses, especially an older animal with a scar on its flank. "This is Thunder," Raphael explained, when he noticed her gaze. "He was my first rescue. His old owner mistreated him, used cruel spurs. When I bought him, he was almost dead. No one believed he would survive." Helen approached cautiously, extending her hand to touch the horse. "But you believed in him. I believed in his ability to heal if he had a chance," Raphael corrected, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light of the stable. "Sometimes, that's all we need. A chance, a safe space to rebuild ourselves." The look they exchanged then was different from all previous ones. There was a vulnerability, an openness that went beyond words. Helen felt her heart race, and it was no longer from fear. A particularly strong lightning bolt struck nearby, instantly followed by deafening thunder. The horses became agitated again. Helen, startled and instinctively, moved closer to Raphael. He put an arm around her shoulders, a protective, not possessive, gesture. "It's all right," he murmured, so close she could feel his breath. "They're safe now. We're safe." When they returned to the house, they were soaked despite the raincoats. The electricity had gone out, and the living room was lit only by the fire in the fireplace. Raphael went to get towels while Helen remained near the fire, trembling slightly. "Here," he returned, offering her a towel and dry clothes. "But you can change in my room if you want. It's warmer than the bathroom now." Helen accepted the clothes, another one of his shirts, too big for her, and a pair of drawstring sweatpants. She went to Raphael's room, a space she hadn't yet seen. It was simple like the rest of the house, but cozy. A large bed with a dark quilt, an antique wooden dresser, some books on the nightstand, a photograph, which she supposed was of his parents, in a simple frame. She changed quickly, feeling strangely intimate wearing his clothes, being in that space that carried his scent, his essence. When she returned to the living room, Raphael had lit some candles and prepared 2 mugs of spiced mulled wine. To ward off the cold, he offered her a mug. They sat on the rug in front of the fireplace, the flames dancing, casting shadows on the walls. The wine was sweet and warm, going down Helen's throat like a caress. She had never drunk alcohol before. It was forbidden in the congregation. But there on that stormy night it felt natural, part of this new life she was building. "What else have you never experienced?" Raphael asked softly, as if reading her thoughts. Helen reflected, the wine already beginning to relax her. "Almost everything," she confessed with a shy smile. "I've never been to a movie theater. I've never danced. I've never—" She hesitated, blushing. "I've never been kissed." "Not really." Raphael's eyes darkened in the firelight. "Augustus never— He kissed me sometimes, but always—" Helen searched for the words. "Always as if it were his right, not something shared. And always under supervision. We were never truly alone." Raphael took a sip of wine, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your life was very controlled, and yours was very lonely," she replied, surprising them both with her boldness. They were silent for a moment, only the crackling of the fire and the drumming of rain on the roof filling the space between them. Helen realized she was closer to him now, their knees almost touching on the rug. "Helen," Raphael's voice was low, almost a whisper, "what do you want? Now?" In this moment, the question hung between them, laden with possibilities. Helen felt her entire body vibrate with an unknown anticipation. In her father's house, desires were sins to be confessed and repressed. Here, they were invitations to be explored. "I want to live," she replied, her voice firm despite her racing heart. "I want to feel. I want to discover who I am when I'm not being watched, judged, controlled." Raphael put his mug aside and, slowly, as if handling something infinitely precious, reached out to touch her face. His fingers traced the line of Helen's jaw, so lightly it could have been just the breeze. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to fully feel that touch. "May I kiss you?" he asked, and the question itself was a revolution. No one had ever asked permission to touch her before. Helen opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "Yes," she whispered. Raphael leaned in, closing the distance between them with deliberate slowness, giving her all the time in the world to retreat if she wished. But Helen didn't want to retreat. For the first time in her life, she wanted to move forward, to dive in, to discover. Their lips met softly at first, a light touch like butterfly wings. Helen felt a warmth spread through her body, starting where their mouths touched and radiating to her fingertips. Raphael deepened the kiss slowly, his hand sliding to the nape of her neck, burying itself in her loose hair. It was a kiss that told stories, of patience, of respect, of desire contained for weeks. When they finally separated, both were breathless, as if they had run a long distance. "That," Helen murmured, touching her own lips, "that was a real kiss." Raphael smiled, and there was something new in his eyes, a sparkle that blended tenderness and desire. Only the beginning of what you can discover if you wish. Helen felt intoxicated, and it wasn't just the wine. It was by freedom, by desire, by this version of herself that was emerging from the ashes of her old life. She took the initiative this time, leaning forward, seeking his lips again. They kissed for a long time, exploring, discovering, learning the silent language of bodies. Raphael's hands remained respectful, never crossing unspoken boundaries. It was Helen who, gradually, guided him to explore more, a touch on her neck, her shoulders, her back. "We can stop whenever you want," he whispered against her lips. "There's no rush, no expectations." But Helen didn't want to stop. 23 years of repression were crumbling like a broken dam, releasing a desire she barely knew existed within her. She guided his hand to the hem of the shirt she was wearing, a silent permission. Raphael looked at her intensely, seeking certainty in her eyes. What he found there must have convinced him, for slowly, with reverence, he slipped his hand under the fabric, touching the bare skin of her waist. Helen gasped at the contact, closing her eyes to fully absorb the sensation. His hands were rough from farm work, but his touch was delicate, almost venerable. "Look at me," he asked softly. She opened her eyes, meeting his, dark, intense, but completely present and attentive. "I want you to see me," he continued. "I want you to know that you are in control, that you can say no at any time." Those words, more than any caress, completely disarmed Helen. It was the antithesis of everything she had known, a man who didn't demand submission but offered partnership. "I see you, Raphael," she responded, her voice finding new strength. "And I want you to see me too, all of me." With deliberate movements, she removed the shirt she was wearing, exposing herself to the flickering firelight. There was no shame in her gesture, only a silent declaration of autonomy over her own body. Raphael inhaled deeply, his eyes scanning her exposed skin with contained admiration. "You are beautiful," he murmured, but made no move to touch her until she took his hand and guided it. What began before the fireplace continued in his bedroom, in his large bed. Helen discovered her body as an unexplored territory, mapped by Raphael's hands and lips. Every sensation was new, every discovery a small miracle. He guided her with infinite patience, always attentive to her signals, always asking, never assuming. When they finally united completely, it was not a conquest or a submission. It was a meeting of equals, a dance for which Helen found she already knew the steps, even never having danced before. It was as if her body had waited for this moment, for this man who truly saw her, who deeply respected her. Afterward, lying side by side, with the storm still roaring outside, Helen felt a peace she had never known. Her body was sated, her mind clear, her soul complete. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she wanted to be, with whom she wanted to be, doing what she wanted to do. Raphael traced soft patterns on her bare back, his eyes following the movements of his own fingers. "Regretting it?" he asked softly. Helen smiled, turning to face him. "Coming with you that night?" "Being here now?" She touched his face, feeling the texture of his short beard against her fingers. "Not for a second." He kissed her palm, a tender gesture that made her shiver. "What happened today?" he began. "It was my choice," she finished firmly. "My first truly free choice, and I don't regret it." Raphael nodded, pulling her closer. "Tomorrow might be different. You might feel different, and that will also be valid." Helen rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "Tomorrow I will decide again, and the day after, and always. That's the gift you gave me, Raphael. Not just a roof, not just a bed, but the right to choose every single day." They fell asleep like that, intertwined, as the storm gradually calmed outside. The world had changed that night, not just because of what had happened between them, but because of the woman Helen was becoming, mistress of herself, of her body, of her decisions. What neither of them knew was that, while they slept peacefully, in Promise Valley, another storm was brewing. Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher had not given up on his straying daughter, nor had Augustus given up on his stolen fiancée. In the back room of the church, by the light of a single lamp, the two men plotted, fueled by wounded pride and threatened power. "We found something, Pastor," Augustus said, spreading some documents on the table. "Say something that can finish Miller once and for all." The pastor adjusted his glasses, examining the papers. A cold smile formed on his thin lips. "The desert monster's days are numbered," he murmured, "and my daughter will return to the path of righteousness, whether she wants to or not." The conspiracy took shape under the sacred roof, woven with threads of lies and manipulation. But this time, it was not an innocent young woman they would face. It was a woman who had tasted freedom and discovered her own strength, and by her side, a man who had already lost too much to religious falsehood to allow history to repeat itself. The next morning, when Helen woke in Raphael's arms, her first thought was one of surprise that she felt no guilt. All her life she had been taught that desire was sinful, that pleasure was shameful, but all she felt was a deep sense of peace and belonging. Raphael was already awake, watching her with attentive eyes. "Good morning," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Helen smiled, stretching like a cat in the sun. "Good morning. How do you feel?" There was a caution in his question, a respect for any change the daylight might have brought. "Alive," she replied simply, leaning in to kiss him lightly. "I'm more alive than I've ever felt." Raphael visibly relaxed, pulling her closer. "The storm has passed," he commented, indicating the window where sunlight streamed in golden rays, "but it seems to have left some marks on the field. We should check the damage after breakfast." It was so domestic, so normal, talking about daily chores while in bed together. Helen felt a wave of gratitude for this simplicity, for this normalcy that had never been allowed to her before. They got up, dressed, and made breakfast together. There was no awkwardness, just a new dimension of intimacy that added to the respect that already existed between them. Helen moved around the kitchen with an ease that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. This house, this life, this man, everything was becoming hers, by choice, not by imposition. After breakfast, they went to check the storm damage. A section of fence had fallen, some smaller trees were broken, and part of the barn roof would need repairs. They worked side by side all morning, their hands occasionally touching, their gazes meeting with new meaning. It was in the middle of the afternoon, as they finished fixing the fence, that they saw the cloud of dust on the road. Someone was approaching the farm. Raphael straightened up, his face suddenly tense. "We don't usually get visitors." Helen felt a chill run down her spine. Instinctively, she took a step closer to him. Who could it be? "I don't know, but stay here." Raphael handed her the hammer he was using and walked toward the property entrance, his posture alert. The approaching vehicle was an official jeep with the insignia of the Promise Valley Mayor's office. When it stopped, two men got out. The town's sheriff, Ignatius, a middle-aged man everyone knew was a member of Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher's church, and a young man Helen didn't recognize, wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. "Mr. Miller," the sheriff greeted dryly, without extending his hand. "We are here on official business." Raphael crossed his arms, his body a barrier between the newcomers and Helen, who watched from a distance. "What kind of business, Sheriff?" "This is Dr. Marcus Foster, representative of the mayor's legal department." The sheriff indicated the man in the suit. "Yes, he has something to deliver to you." The lawyer stepped forward, extending an envelope. "Mr. Miller, this is a formal notice of investigation into the legality of your ownership of these lands. We have received complaints that the original documentation may have been falsified." Raphael took the envelope, his face impassive, but Helen could see the tension in his shoulders. "Falsified? These lands have been in my family for 3 generations. Well, that's what you'll have to prove in court," the sheriff commented with thinly veiled pleasure. "In the meantime, there is a preliminary injunction to suspend all commercial activity on the property until the case is resolved." Helen felt her blood run cold. She didn't need to be a genius to understand what was happening. Her father and Augustus were using the power they had in town to target Raphael, and, by extension, herself. "Who made the complaint?" Raphael asked, his voice controlled, but Helen could hear the contained anger. "It's confidential information at this time." The lawyer replied mechanically, "But everything will be revealed during the legal process." "We have orders to conduct a preliminary inspection of the property," the sheriff added, a thin smile on his lips, "for the purpose of documenting the case." Raphael took a step forward, his presence suddenly intimidating. "Do you have a warrant for that?" The sheriff's smile faltered. "Well, not exactly, but then there will be no inspection." Raphael cut in firmly. "I know my rights, Sheriff. Without a court order, you don't set foot beyond this gate." The sheriff frowned, clearly displeased. "That could be interpreted as obstruction, Miller." "That could be interpreted as knowing the law, Sheriff," Raphael retorted. "Now, if you have no further official business, I ask that you leave my property." The two men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this resistance. Finally, the sheriff shrugged. "As you wish, Miller, but this is just the beginning. Judge Martin is already aware of the case, and he doesn't usually look kindly on troublesome outsiders." Judge Martin's name made Helen shiver. A close friend of her father's, a regular at parsonage dinners, he was known for his moral rectitude. which in practice meant favoring the church's interests above all else. When the jeep finally drove away, kicking up dust on the road, Raphael remained motionless for a few moments, the crumpled envelope in his hand. Helen approached, touching his arm lightly. "My father is behind this," she said, her voice trembling with anger and worry. "And Augustus, too." Raphael nodded, his face grim. "Yes, they couldn't attack me directly. So they're trying to hit me where they know it hurts, this land, my inheritance. What will we do?" Raphael looked at her, determination replacing anger in his eyes. "We will fight. I won't let them take this from us, neither the land nor our freedom." Helen felt a wave of warmth at hearing "our freedom," the confirmation that she was no longer alone in this battle. But she also felt fear. She knew her father's power and influence in Promise Valley well. He controlled not only the inhabitants' faith, but also their opinions, their businesses, their decisions. "Raphael," she said hesitantly, "you don't know my father like I do. He won't stop. This is just the beginning." Raphael pulled her close, kissing her forehead softly. "I won't stop either, Helen. I've already lost too much to men like him. I won't lose you too." That night, after a silent and tense dinner, Raphael spread old documents across the living room table. Deeds, contracts, yellowed photographs. The history of the Miller family and that land, told in paper and ink. "My grandfather bought these lands legally almost 70 years ago," he explained, showing the original deed. "He built everything from scratch. My father expanded the property, bought a few more acres. Everything documented, everything legal." Helen examined the papers carefully. "But why does my father think he can contest this now?" Raphael ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. "There must be something we're not seeing, some detail, some loophole they intend to exploit." Helen continued to leaf through the documents until a photograph caught her attention. It was old, showing a young couple in front of a house that wasn't the current farm. The man was clearly Raphael's father, younger. But the woman— "Who is she?" she asked, pointing to the photograph. Raphael took the image, his face softening. "My mother. Before—" He didn't finish, but it wasn't necessary. Helen studied the woman's face. Young, beautiful, with kind eyes and a shy smile. There was something familiar about that face, something she couldn't precisely identify. "What was her name?" she asked softly. "Cecilia. Cecilia Ashton. Before she married," Raphael replied, stroking the photograph with his thumb. "She was a teacher at the rural school, before your father convinced the congregation that she was indoctrinating the children with worldly ideas." The surname made something click in Helen's memory. "Ashton. My mother had a sister with that surname, a sister I never knew, who was never mentioned." Raphael looked at her intently. "Are you saying—" "I don't know." Helen shook her head, confused. "My father never talked about my mother's family. He said they were straying people, that we had cut ties for reasons of faith." They looked at each other, the same suspicion growing in both. If Raphael's mother and Helen's mother were sisters, it changed everything, not just the dynamic between them, but it could also be at the heart of the conspiracy they faced. "Yeah, we need to find out more," Raphael said, determined. "If there's a family connection, maybe it explains why your father has so much resentment, so much determination to destroy my family." Helen agreed, a new resolve rising within her. "And maybe it explains why he was always so controlling with me. Maybe he feared I would discover something, that I would follow the same path as my aunt." They worked late, organizing documents, trying to build a timeline, searching for clues. The night advanced, but the mystery only deepened. What had started as a simple land dispute was revealing itself to be a much more complex plot, rooted in family secrets, old betrayals, and hidden truths. When they finally went to bed, exhausted but determined, Helen snuggled into Raphael's arms, feeling his strength around her. "I'm afraid of what we might discover," she confessed in the dark. Raphael hugged her tighter. "The truth can be painful, but it's always better than a lie. Believe me, I've lived much of my life in the shadow of the lies they told about my family. It's time to bring everything to light." Helen closed her eyes, trying to push away the fear. She knew she was on the right path, even if it was difficult. For the first time, she was fighting for something that truly mattered, not just for Raphael or for herself, but for the truth her father had tried to bury for so long. Sleep finally enveloped her, but it was restless, populated by fragmented dreams where familiar faces merged. Her father's severe face, Augustus's possessive gaze, the gentle smile of the mother she barely remembered, and the sad eyes of the woman in the photograph, the aunt she had never known, the mother of the man she now loved. Yes, she loved him. The realization came amidst the confused dreams. She loved Raphael, not with the obedient, fearful love she had been taught to feel, but with something real, deep, and freely chosen. And for this love, for this newfound truth, she was willing to face any storm that came, including the one her own father was preparing, in the shadows of the temple that had for so long been her prison. Morning arrived with cruel clarity, the sun shining over the farm as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Helen felt it as soon as she opened her eyes, the weight of the threat hanging over them like a persistent shadow. Raphael was already up, talking on the phone in the living room in a low, tense voice. "I understand. Yes, I'll bring all the documents. Thank you for the heads up, Doctor." He hung up when Helen entered the room, wearing one of his shirts. There was a tension in his shoulders that she had already learned to recognize. "Who was it?" she asked, pouring herself coffee. "A lawyer from Riverton, a friend of my father's. I managed to schedule an appointment for this afternoon." Raphael ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his worry. "We need someone who has no ties to Promise Valley, someone not under your father's influence." Helen nodded, sitting at the table. "I'm coming with you." Raphael looked at her, a hesitation in his eyes. "Are you sure? It could be dangerous. If your father or Augustus find out—" "I've already made my choice, Raphael," she interrupted him, her voice firm. "I won't hide. I won't go back to being that scared girl they controlled." A brief smile touched his lips. "You've changed. I'm becoming who I was always meant to be," she replied, reaching out to touch his hand across the table. "And I want to fight for it, for us." 3 hours later, they were in the waiting room of Dr. Mark Turner's office, a middle-aged man with shrewd eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses. His office was in downtown Riverton, a city large enough to be outside the immediate reach of Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher's influence, but close enough to know Promise Valley's reputation. Raphael Miller. The lawyer greeted, shaking his hand firmly. His eyes turned to Helen with polite curiosity. "And this must be Helen." She introduced herself, deliberately omitting her surname. "Thank you for seeing us so urgently." "I was intrigued by the case when Raphael called." The lawyer indicated chairs for them to sit, while he himself took his place behind his organized desk. "It's not every day I get a call about a possible conspiracy involving the most influential church in the region." Raphael placed the folder with the documents on the table. "It's not just about the church, Doctor. It's about land, power, and, apparently, about family secrets that are resurfacing." For over an hour, they explained the situation, the arrival of the investigation notice, the suspicion of Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher's and Augustus's involvement, and the recent discovery of the possible family connection between Raphael's mother and Helen's mother. Dr. Turner listened attentively, making occasional notes, his face remaining neutral. When they finished, he removed his glasses and meticulously cleaned them with a tissue, a habit that seemed to give him time to organize his thoughts. "Let's analyze the facts," he began, putting his glasses back on. "You have all the original property documentation, which appears to be in order. The complaint is vague, mentioning only alleged falsification, without specifying which document is under suspicion. And there's this Judge Martin, who has close ties to the pastor. And to Augustus," Helen added. "The judge's son works for him in church administration." The lawyer nodded, absorbing the information. A well-woven web of influence, typical of small towns with centralized power structures. He flipped through some of the documents Raphael had brought. "But there's something that intrigues me. Why now? If the pastor has always had this influence, why wait so long to attack the legality of the Miller property?" "Because now it's personal," Helen replied, her voice low but firm. "I chose Raphael. I chose to leave the church, to abandon the arranged marriage. My father would never forgive such public humiliation. And Augustus lost not only a fiancée, but his status in the congregation. Raphael completed. He was seen as the pastor's natural successor, the man who would marry the spiritual leader's daughter and eventually take control. Dr. Turner intertwined his fingers, thoughtful. So we're dealing with wounded pride, threatened power, and revenge. Powerful motives. He stood up, walking to a small table with a coffee maker. He poured 3 cups and offered them to his clients before continuing. But something is still missing from this story, he said, returning to his chair. The connection between the families. If Raphael's mother really was your mother's sister, Helen, that could explain much more about the pastor's behavior over the years. It wouldn't just be about the land or the recent scandal. It would be about something much older and deeper. Helen sipped her coffee, reflecting, My father never talked about my mother's family. When I asked, he would just say they had chosen the path of perdition, and that we had cut ties for spiritual purity. I always thought it was just another one of his religious justifications to control who I could or couldn't know. We need to investigate this connection, the lawyer stated, decisive. If we can prove there's a personal conflict of interest behind this alleged legal investigation, we can disqualify the case before it even reaches a judge. And if we discover that the pastor is hiding something about your family's past, we might have a powerful weapon to defend ourselves. Where do we start? Raphael asked. Civil records, Dr. Turner replied promptly. Birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates. Documents that cannot be easily manipulated, even by someone with the pastor's influence. He paused, looking directly at Helen. And do you know your mother's maiden name? Helen hesitated. Clara Ashton, I believe. She died when I was 8. My father rarely spoke of her afterward. And Raphael's mother was Cecilia Ashton. The lawyer wrote down the names. I will assign an investigator to search for these records immediately. In the meantime, you need to be cautious. If the pastor and Augustus are willing to use dubious legal means to target you, we cannot rule out other tactics. Raphael nodded gravely. I'll reinforce security on the farm, and I suggest you avoid Promise Valley for now. The lawyer added, Helen, especially you, as the pastor's daughter, your presence in town could create complicated situations. She agreed, though she felt a pang of frustration. There was still something in Promise Valley she needed to face, not just her father, but her own past, the memories she had left behind when she chose freedom. As they left the office, Raphael held Helen's hand, a silent gesture of support. The afternoon was clear, the sky an intense blue that seemed to mock the gravity of the situation they faced. What are you thinking? He asked as they walked to the car. Helen took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. That there might be something in the parsonage that could help us. Some document, some clue about my mother's and your mother's past. My father always kept a locked office where he stored his personal files. Raphael stopped, turning to face her. You're not thinking of going back there? It wasn't a question, but Helen answered anyway. That's exactly what I'm thinking. Helen, it's too dangerous. His voice was tense, worried. If your father or Augustus catch you, they won't, she stated, with a confidence she didn't know she possessed until that moment. I know that house better than anyone. I know when my father leaves for pastoral visits. I know where he keeps the keys. I know all the corners where I used to hide as a child. And most importantly, I know exactly what to look for. Raphael ran a hand over his face, clearly torn between the need for information and the fear of putting her in danger. I can't let you go alone. You can't come with me either, Helen argued, softly but firmly. You are the last person who could enter that town unnoticed. I, on the other hand, can disguise myself. No one would expect the obedient pastor's daughter to return like this of her own free will. Helen, Raphael, she interrupted him, holding his hands. Since I fled that life, I've been making choices, my own choices. This is another one. I need to face this past to be able to move forward. I need to find these answers not just for us, but for myself. He looked at her for a long time, the conflict evident in his eyes. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. When? Tomorrow, she decided. Wednesday is pastoral visit day. My father leaves early and only returns at dusk. It will be our best chance. The plan was simple, but risky. Raphael would drop her off near Promise Valley, from where she would walk to the parsonage using a back path she knew from childhood. Once there, she would have a few hours to search for any documents or clues about the connection between the families. Afterward, she would meet Raphael at the same spot for the return. That night, on the farm, the tension was palpable. Dinner, washing dishes, tidying the kitchen, everyday gestures performed with an additional weight, as if each moment were precious, as if the future were too uncertain to be taken for granted. When they finally went to bed, there were no words, only the silent desperation of bodies that sought each other, found each other, loved each other, as if it were the last time. Helen memorized every sensation, the texture of Raphael's skin under her fingers, the warmth of his lips, the rhythm of his breathing when he finally fell asleep. A protective arm still around her. But sleep didn't come for Helen. She lay awake, watching the ceiling, mentally rehearsing each step of the plan for the next day. She couldn't deny the fear, not just of physical danger, but of facing the past, of confronting the lies upon which her life had been built. What would she discover in her father's locked office? What truths had been hidden from her all those years? Dawn arrived too quickly. Helen dressed in discreet clothes, jeans, a dark t-shirt, a cap to hide her hair. Nothing that resembled the modest pastor's daughter in her demure dresses. Raphael prepared a breakfast they barely touched, anxiety robbing them of their appetite. If anything goes wrong, if you feel the slightest sign of danger, leave immediately, Raphael repeated as he placed a small backpack in the back seat of the pickup. Don't risk it. Documents are not worth your safety. Helen nodded, though both knew she wouldn't back down easily. Not anymore. The woman who had left Promise Valley weeks ago was not the same one now planning to return. There was a determination in her, a strength that not even fear could shake. The drive to the outskirts of town was made in tense silence. Raphael stopped the pickup on a secondary road, hidden by trees, about a kilometer from town. I'll be here the whole time, he said, holding her face in his hands. If you're not back in 3 hours, I'm coming after you. Helen smiled faintly. I'll be back before then. She kissed him briefly, a touch of promise. You be careful too. If anyone from town passes by here, I know how to hide, he assured. I've done it for years, remember? She nodded, adjusted the backpack on her back and got out of the car. The path she would take was a shortcut she used as a teenager. On the rare occasions she managed to escape constant surveillance for a few moments of solitude. It crossed a small woods and came out at the back of the parsonage property, far from the curious eyes of the congregation. Helen's heart pounded as she walked along the familiar path, each step bringing back memories she had tried to suppress, the feeling of suffocation, of being constantly watched, judged, the weight of expectations, the guilt for every independent thought, every secret desire. When she finally spotted the back of the parsonage, she stopped for a moment, breathing deeply. The two-story building, impeccably painted white, with tall windows and a small back porch, seemed smaller than she remembered, less imposing, less terrifying. Helen checked her watch, 9:20. Her father should have already left for pastoral visits. The housekeeper, Mrs. Zuleika, would be at the market at this time, doing the week's shopping. The house would be empty. With cautious steps, she approached the back door. The spare key was still hidden under the fern pot, exactly where it had always been. Some things never changed in Promise Valley. Predictability was a security for those who feared the new. The door opened silently. Helen entered the kitchen, all her senses alert. The familiar scent, a mix of cleaning products, strong coffee, and the lavender perfume Mrs. Zuleika used, hit her with a wave of unwanted nostalgia. For a moment, she almost expected to hear her father's stern voice calling her for morning prayer. But the house was silent, empty. Helen quickly crossed the kitchen, following the hallway to the stairs leading to the second floor. Her father's office was at the end of the upper hallway, a room always locked, where he spent hours preparing sermons, meeting congregation members in private conversations, and keeping his personal files. The office door, as expected, was locked. But Helen knew where the key was kept, in a small box in her father's bedroom, hidden in his nightstand. She headed to the bedroom, trying to ignore the feeling of violating a sacred space. She was no longer the obedient daughter. She was an intruder seeking the truth. The key was exactly where she remembered. With trembling fingers, she returned to the office and unlocked the door. The room was exactly as in her memories: bookshelves covering 2 walls, a heavy wooden desk in the center, an imposing crucifix on the wall behind the chair. The air smelled of old books and authority. Helen closed the door behind her and began her methodical search. The church files were on a shelf to the left, organized by year and type: financial records, meeting minutes, membership rosters. But these were not what she was looking for. The pastor's personal documents would be elsewhere. Her eyes fixed on the low cabinet behind the desk. Locked, of course. But years of silent observation had taught her that the key was in a small secret compartment in the central desk drawer. Helen opened the drawer, found the compartment, and there it was, a small golden key. The cabinet contained several folders organized with the obsessive meticulousness that characterized her father: property deeds, insurance policies, bank documents, and at the bottom, a wooden box with the simple label Clara. Helen's heart raced. Clara, her mother. Carefully, she removed the box and placed it on the desk. Inside, she found letters yellowed with time, old photographs, official documents. She began to examine them methodically, aware that time was limited. The letters were correspondence between her parents, from their dating days. The formal, almost bureaucratic tone accurately reflected the type of relationship they had. Not a union of love, but an agreement based on shared values and divine purpose. Helen felt a deep sadness for the mother she had barely known, trapped in such a cold marriage. Among the documents, she found her parents' marriage certificate and, more importantly, her mother's birth certificate, which confirmed Clara Ashton, daughter of Anthony Ashton and Josephine Ashton, the same surnames as Raphael's mother. But it was a photograph that made her heart stop. It showed 2 young women, arms linked, smiling at the camera. One of them was clearly her mother. The other, undoubtedly, was the woman in the photograph at Raphael's house, Cecilia. On the back of the photograph, a simple inscription: Clara and Cecilia, sisters always, 1980. Helen felt tears in her eyes. So it was true. Her mother and Raphael's mother were sisters, which meant that she and Raphael were... A noise downstairs interrupted her thoughts. Footsteps. Someone had entered the house. Quickly, Helen put the photograph back in her backpack, along with her mother's birth certificate. She placed the box back in the cabinet, locking it. She was about to leave the office when she heard voices, male voices she would recognize anywhere: her father and Augustus. "We can't wait any longer, Pastor. The judge is hesitant. We need something more concrete." "I have everything under control, Augustus," her father's voice, authoritative as always. "The documents are almost ready." Helen felt a chill. What documents? What were they planning? The footsteps approached the stairs. There was no way out without being seen. Desperate, Helen looked around, searching for a hiding place. The built-in closet on the side wall, large enough for one person, where her father kept his research materials. It was her only chance. Silently, she entered the closet, closing the door just as the voices reached the hallway. Through a small crack, she saw her father and Augustus enter the office. "Where are they?" Augustus asked, impatient. Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher went to the desk, opened a drawer Helen hadn't checked, and pulled out a folder. Here. The original deed for the Miller lands. Helen held her breath. How did her father have that document? And the other papers, the will, Augustus insisted. All here. The pastor opened the folder, spreading documents on the table. Anthony Ashton's original will, leaving everything to his 2 daughters in equal parts, the deed showing that the lands originally belonged to him, and the document Cecilia signed, transferring her share to Clara when she married that good-for-nothing Miller. Helen watched, stunned. Her grandfather, her mother's and Cecilia's father, had been the original owner of the lands where Raphael's farm now stood. Lands that, apparently, should have been divided between the sisters. "But this doesn't help us, Pastor." Augustus sounded frustrated. "If Cecilia legally transferred her share to Clara, and Clara was your wife, then technically the lands are yours by right. There's nothing irregular about Miller's possession." A cold smile formed on Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher's lips, a smile Helen knew well, the smile that preceded his most calculating moments. Unless... He picked up one of the documents, examining it. Unless the transfer was never officially registered. And that, after Clara's death, I reinterpreted the situation. Augustus stared at him, slowly understanding. You falsified documents. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement. I rewrote history, Augustus. The pastor corrected, his tone calm, almost didactic. When Clara died, Cecilia was already under my spiritual guidance, weak, impressionable. I convinced her that her husband was possessed, that her son was being raised in sin. She signed everything I put in front of her, including a new version of her father's will, where he supposedly disinherited Cecilia for her impure marriage. Helen covered her mouth with her hand, horrified. Her own father confessed manipulation, falsification of documents, destruction of a family, all in the name of power and control. But what about the boy? Augustus asked. Cecilia's son. Wouldn't he inherit his mother's share? Not if the mother had been officially disinherited, the pastor explained patiently. Furthermore, when Cecilia died, I managed to keep the boy away. His father, devastated by the loss, was not in a position to fight me, especially when I presented the official documents showing that the lands belonged to Clara and therefore to me as her widower. Augustus nodded slowly, absorbing the extent of the plan. And now, why bring this up after so long? The pastor's face hardened. Because that damned Miller dared to take my daughter from me, dared to humiliate this congregation, to humiliate you, and worse, because Helen may eventually discover the truth if she continues with him. What truth, exactly? Augustus insisted. That she and Raphael Miller are cousins, the pastor replied dryly. That the monster she chose to follow shares her blood, a union condemned by God and by men. Helen felt as if the ground disappeared beneath her feet. Cousins. She and Raphael were cousins. The man who had shown her what freedom was, the man she loved, was her first cousin. And what's the plan now? Augustus asked, calmer, calculating. To present a modified version of these documents to the judge, to show that the lands never legitimately belonged to the Millers, that they were stolen from our family. The pastor put the papers back in the folder. Judge Martin won't question it. He owes us many favors. And when the lands are confiscated, when Miller is ruined, the pastor's smile returned, crueler. Helen will have no choice but to return to the congregation that raised her, to the fiancé who awaits her, repentant, humiliated, obedient. Augustus didn't seem entirely convinced. What if she resists, if she finds out what we're doing? She won't find out, the pastor stated with certainty. And even if she suspected, it would be her word against mine, the word of a rebellious girl against that of a man of God, respected by the entire community. He didn't know how wrong he was. Helen, in her hiding place, gripped the strap of her backpack where she had stored the evidence, the photograph of the sisters, the birth certificate that proved their kinship, and now she had heard her father's direct confession, the lie, the manipulation, the theft disguised as religious righteousness. The two men continued talking for a few minutes, discussing details of the plan, before finally leaving the office. Helen waited, her heart pounding so hard she feared they could hear it, until she was sure they had gone downstairs. She cautiously left the closet, her mind working frantically. She needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. She needed to tell Raphael what she had discovered, both about the conspiracy and about their kinship. But most importantly, she needed to take the evidence she had found and what her father kept in the desk drawer. Silently, she approached the drawer the pastor had mentioned. It was locked. Frustrated, Helen looked around, searching for the key, when she heard footsteps returning. There was no time. She would have to leave without the original documents. Quickly, she left the office, locking the door and returning the key to the bedroom. She went downstairs through the back, alert to any sound. Voices came from the front living room. Her father and Augustus were still in the house, probably finalizing the details of their wicked plan. Helen slid through the kitchen and reached the back door. Freedom was just a few steps away when a voice paralyzed her. "I knew you'd come back." Augustus stood at the kitchen entrance, blocking her escape route. His face wore a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "You were always predictable, Helen. Your father said you weren't, that you were an unpredictable disappointment. But I knew you better." Helen instinctively recoiled, looking for another way out. There was none. "Let me go, Augustus." Her voice sounded firmer than she expected. "It's over. I know what you did, what you're planning." His smile vanished. "What exactly do you think you know?" "Everything," she replied, trying to buy time, calculating her chances. "About the lands, about how my father manipulated Raphael's mother, about the falsified documents." Augustus took a step forward. "So you really have been snooping. Your father will be disappointed, even more than he already is." "My father is a liar and a thief," Helen retorted, anger replacing fear. "He stole what rightfully belonged to Raphael's family. He used religion to manipulate, control, destroy lives. Your father did what was necessary to protect this community. To protect you, you ungrateful girl." Augustus was getting closer and closer. "And now you're going home to your true family. To me." Helen felt her back touch the wall. She was cornered. "Never," she whispered, with fierce determination. "I will never return to this prison. I will never again be controlled by you." Augustus reached her, gripping her arm tightly. "You have no choice, Helen. You never did." It was at that moment that Helen realized he was right. She had never had a choice. Until that night in the square, when Raphael appeared and offered her an alternative, a different life, freedom, and now she had to fight for that freedom. With a quick and decisive movement, Helen used her knee with all her might against Augustus's groin. He doubled over in pain, releasing her arm. Without hesitation, she ran to the back door, pushing it open with all her strength. "Ezekiel!" Augustus screamed, still doubled over in pain. "She's here!" Helen ran through the backyard, toward the woods that would lead her back to Raphael. Behind her, she could hear her father's voice calling, Augustus's heavy footsteps recovering, chasing her. Fear gave wings to her feet. She ran through the woods like a hunted animal, branches lashing her face, roots almost tripping her. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Freedom and Raphael were ahead of her, and all the oppressive past was behind. When she finally spotted the pickup truck hidden among the trees, she felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made her collapse. Raphael was there, leaning against the hood, tense, worried. Seeing her running, his face lit up for a second, before registering her state, gasping, scratched, pursued. "Helen!" He ran to meet her. "They're coming," she gasped, reaching him. "My father, Augustus. They saw me." Raphael quickly pulled her into the car, starting the engine at the same instant. The pickup sped off at high speed, kicking up dust, just as two figures emerged from the woods. Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher and Augustus C., their faces contorted in fury. Helen looked back only once, seeing the figures shrink in the distance, her past, literally, fading behind her. "What happened?" Raphael asked, focused on the road, accelerating away from Promise Valley. Helen took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts, deciding where to begin. There was so much to tell, so much to process. "I found out the truth," she said finally, opening her backpack to show the photograph and the documents. "About us, about what my father did." As they drove back to the farm, Helen recounted everything, what she had found, the conversation she had witnessed while hidden, her father's confession about falsifying documents, about manipulating Raphael's mother, and finally, the truth she still couldn't fully process. "We're cousins, Raphael." Her voice faltered slightly. "Your mother and mine were sisters, daughters of the same man who originally owned the lands where your farm is." Raphael kept his eyes on the road, his profile tense, but not surprised. "I suspected," he admitted finally. "There was something familiar about you from the first moment, something in your eyes, in your smile, as if I already knew you, somehow. My father used that against us, said it's a condemned union." Raphael finally looked at her briefly. "And what do you think?" Helen reflected for a moment. "I think I've outgrown my father's condemnations. I think what we've built is truer, more honest than any relationship blessed by him ever was." A small smile touched Raphael's lips. So nothing changed for you? Everything changed, Helen replied, placing her hand over his on the steering wheel. Now I know that what united us wasn't just chance. It was destiny correcting a past mistake. Anthony Ashton's daughters were separated by manipulation, but their children found each other. And more importantly, now we have proof of what your father did. What exactly? He forged documents to take possession of the lands that should have been shared between my mother and yours. He used his religious influence to manipulate your mother. And now he's preparing a new falsification to present to Judge Martin, to take what remains of your family's inheritance. Raphael absorbed the information, his face hardening. We need to talk to Dr. Turner immediately. At the farm, they called the lawyer, who listened attentively to Helen's account. His voice over the phone sounded both shocked and analytical. This changes everything, he concluded. The confession you overheard, combined with the documents you obtained, could be enough to initiate a serious investigation, not against Raphael, but against your father. What about Judge Martin? Raphael asked. And if he's involved, we'll take the case to a higher court, to the state capital. The lawyer replied decisively. With this evidence, we can get a court order to access the original documents in the pastor's office, and more importantly, we can ask for protection for both of you. The conversation continued for a few minutes, with the lawyer detailing the next legal steps. When they finally hung up, Helen and Raphael looked at each other in silence, processing everything that had happened, everything they had discovered. They'll come after us, Helen said finally, expressing the fear that hung over them both. My father won't give up easily. Raphael nodded gravely. We're not safe here, not anymore. Where do we go then? To Riverton, for now. Dr. Turner has an apartment we can use until the case is presented to the Superior Court. Raphael held her hands. It's only temporary. When all this is over, we can come back. Rebuild. Helen looked around the farm living room, the space that had become her home, where she had discovered freedom, desire, love. The idea of leaving it, even temporarily, broke her heart. But she knew Raphael was right. How much time do we have? Not much. We need to leave today. Raphael was already moving, grabbing a suitcase, starting to gather essentials. They worked quickly, in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts as they packed clothes, important documents, a few personal items. Helen found the photograph of Raphael's mother, the aunt she had never known, and carefully placed it among her things. They were almost finished when they heard it, the sound of vehicles approaching the farm road. Many vehicles. Raphael rushed to the window, cautiously pulling back the curtain. 3 cars. The sheriff is here, and your father, and Augustus. Helen felt her heart freeze. They don't waste time. Go to the back, Raphael instructed quickly, grabbing the bags. There's a trail that leads to the creek. On the other side, there's a path few people know. We can escape that way. But before they could move, loud knocks on the front door echoed through the house. Raphael Miller, the sheriff's authoritative voice. Open the door. We have a search and seizure warrant. Raphael and Helen looked at each other, the same determination reflected in both. They would not flee like criminals. Not this time. We'll wait for them, Raphael decided, picking up the phone. And we'll call Dr. Turner immediately. They may have a warrant, but we have the truth. The knocking continued, louder, more insistent. Helen took a deep breath, preparing to face her past one last time. Her father, Augustus, all the structure of power and control they had built in Promise Valley. I'm with you, she said, holding Raphael's hand firmly. Until the end. Raphael opened the door. The sheriff was at the front, flanked by 2 officers. Behind them, Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher and Augustus, both with thinly veiled expressions of triumph. Raphael Miller, the sheriff began formally, we have a warrant for the search and seizure of documents related to the ownership of this farm, and a warrant for your temporary arrest, accused of falsifying documents and unlawful appropriation of land. Raphael remained calm, impassive. May I see the warrants, please? The sheriff handed over the documents, which Raphael examined carefully. And Miss Helen must also come with us? The sheriff continued, looking past Raphael to where Helen stood. At your father's request, for your own protection. My daughter was kidnapped and manipulated. Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher stepped forward, his voice imbued with the authority he used in the pulpit. "She is clearly under this man's undue influence." Helen felt anger rise, hot and powerful. She stepped forward, placing herself beside Raphael. "I wasn't kidnapped, Father. I fled. I chose to leave that life of lies and control." Her voice was firm, without tremor. "And now I know everything. About the lands. About how you manipulated Raphael's mother. About the documents you falsified." The pastor's face paled slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Helen is confused. Sheriff, this man filled her with lies, turned her against her own family, her own faith." "I have proof," Helen countered, taking the documents from her backpack. "The photograph of my mother with Cecilia Ashton, sisters, the birth certificate confirming the kinship, and most importantly, I heard you and Augustus confessing everything this morning, in your office." A heavy silence fell over the group. The sheriff looked from Helen to the pastor, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the situation was taking. "This is absurd," Augustus interjected, stepping forward menacingly. "She's lying to protect this criminal. I advise you not to approach further, Mr. Augustus." Dr. Turner's voice sounded from behind the group. The lawyer had just arrived, accompanied by two men in suits, clearly not from Promise Valley. "Who are you?" the sheriff asked, confused by the new presence. "Dr. Mark Turner, attorney for Mr. Miller and Miss Helen." He introduced himself formally, approaching, "And these are Doctors Carter and Menzies from the State Prosecutor's Office. We came at their request with a court order to investigate complaints of document falsification, abuse of religious authority, and corruption involving Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher and Judge Martin of Promise Valley." The sheriff seemed completely lost, his gaze jumping between the pastor and the prosecutors. I wasn't informed. The investigation began only a few hours ago, after we received substantial evidence." One of the prosecutors explained, handing official documents to the sheriff. "And it seems we arrived at an opportune moment." Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher took a step back, his face now visibly pale. "This is absurd. A conspiracy against a man of God." "Documents don't lie, Pastor," Dr. Turner replied calmly, "and neither do witnesses, especially when that witness is your own daughter." What followed was a succession of events that Helen observed almost as if she were outside her own body. The arrest warrant against Raphael was revoked on the spot by the prosecutors. New warrants were presented for search and seizure of documents in the pastor's office, for the interrogation of Judge Martin, for investigation of church finances, and finally, the image she had never imagined seeing, her father and Augustus being led to an official car, not formally arrested yet, but summoned to provide immediate clarification in the state capitol. When everyone finally left, leaving only Helen and Raphael on the farm porch, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and red. A late afternoon, almost identical to the one where it all began weeks ago in the square of Promise Valley. "Is it over?" Helen asked, her voice small, still not believing the turn their lives had taken in just one day. Raphael pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her protectively. "Not completely. There will be interrogations, depositions, a long process ahead, but the worst is over. The truth is coming to light." "What about us?" she asked, raising her face to look at him. "We're cousins. Does that change anything for you?" Raphael touched her face gently, those same intense eyes that had captivated her from the first moment, now filled with a quiet certainty. "It only changes this. Now I know why I felt I had known you forever." He smiled slightly. "Perhaps our shared blood recognized each other, even when our minds didn't know, but no. It doesn't change what I feel for you. It doesn't change what we've built together." Helen smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't known in a long time. "Do you think our mothers would have approved? Clara and Cecilia? I think they would have been happy to know that their children found what they themselves could never fully have. Freedom to choose, freedom to love." They stood there, embraced on the porch, watching the sun set over the land they now knew was truly theirs, not just by legal documents that would eventually be corrected, but by right of blood, by inheritance from their mothers, separated by manipulation and control, but reunited through them. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be stares, comments, judgments, promise, Valley would have to rebuild its faith on new foundations. Without the dominant figure of Pastor Ezekiel Fletcher, Helen and Raphael would have to face depositions, perhaps even a formal trial. But they were together. They had chosen each other, not by imposition or manipulation, but by love freely offered and accepted. And this was the only promise that mattered, not the promise made at the altar before a congregation, but the silent promise made between two hearts that had found, in each other, the home they had always sought. When night finally fell over the farm, Helen and Raphael went inside, closing the door not to hide from the world, but to celebrate the victory they had won together. The victory of truth over lies, of freedom over control, of love over fear. And as the moon rose in the sky, bathing the room with its silvery light, two bodies met again, now with no secrets between them, no shadows of the past, only the vivid present and the future they would build, side by side, choice after choice, day after day. In the stable, the old horse Thunder, once wounded and rejected, now healed and strong, rested peacefully. Like his owners, he had found on the farm not just a shelter, but a place to heal his wounds, to grow, to be truly free. And when the first ray of morning sun broke the horizon, it found Helen already awake, watching Raphael sleep beside her. Her fingers lightly traced the contour of his face, memorizing every detail, every line, every expression. This was her home now. This man, this farm, this life she had chosen. No longer the pastor's daughter, no longer the promised fiancée, no longer the silenced girl. Just Helen, woman, lover, warrior, free to speak, free to feel, free to be. Outside, Promise Valley awoke to a new day, unaware of how the revelations to come would forever change the small town. The truth, like the sun, could not be contained forever. Eventually, it found its way through the densest clouds, illuminating even the darkest corners. And as the sun rose in the sky, Helen smiled, grateful for having found her own truth, her own light, her own path. A path that had begun that night in the square, when a man everyone feared offered her the only thing no one had ever offered before, a choice, and she had chosen well.